My name is Sarah, and I'm 28 years old now. But every morning, I still wake up feeling like that terrified 8-year-old girl who learned to smile on command. People always told me I had the perfect childhood. Perfect house with white picket fence, perfect parents who attended every school event, perfect family dinners around our mahogany table. What they didn't see was the battlefield that existed behind our pristine front door, where silence was weaponized and love came with conditions that changed without warning. The war began subtly, like most wars do. It started with my mother's particular way of arranging flowers, each stem positioned with mathematical precision, her jaw tightening when I dared to touch the vase. It escalated with my father's newspaper ritual, the way he'd snap the pages with increasing aggression when anything disrupted his morning routine. By the time I turned 7, I had learned to navigate our house like a minefield, memorizing which floorboards creaked, which topics were forbidden, which version of myself was acceptable on any given day. Our living room was a museum where children weren't supposed to live. Cream-colored sofas that couldn't be sat on, glass coffee tables that reflected every fingerprint like accusations, Persian rugs that documented every footstep. I spent most of my childhood perched on the edge of furniture, ready to flee at the first sign of disapproval. My parents weren't cruel in the traditional sense. They never raised their hands to me, never screamed or threw things. Their weapons were far more sophisticated. Disappointment delivered through sighs, love withdrawn. Without explanation, praise given only when I performed to their exacting standards. The neighborhood kids envied me. They saw the swimming pool in our backyard, the elaborate birthday parties my mother orchestrated, the expensive clothes that hung in my closet like costumes for a play I never auditioned for. They didn't know that the pool was more prop than pleasure, that the parties were stages for my parents to showcase their parenting skills, that my clothes were chosen not for comfort but for the image they projected. I was their masterpiece, their proof of success. Their living trophy displayed for admiration. School became my sanctuary, the only place where I could breathe without measuring each inhalation. Mrs. Henderson, my third-grade teacher, had kind eyes and a voice that never carried hidden meanings. When she praised my artwork, I felt something unfamiliar blooming in my chest, acceptance without conditions. But even this refuge came with its own anxiety because I knew that each day ended with a return to the battlefield, where my parents would dissect my performance like forensic scientists examining evidence. The turning point came on a Tuesday in October. I remember it was Tuesday because my mother always made meatloaf on Tuesdays, and the smell still makes my stomach clench with remembered dread. I had brought home a math test with a grade of 92%, proud of my improvement from the previous week's 87. I practically skipped into the kitchen, my backpack bouncing against my small frame, ready to share my achievement. My mother looked at the paper for exactly 3 seconds before placing it on the counter without comment. My father glanced up from his evening paper long enough to ask why it wasn't 100%. That night, lying in my bed with its perfectly coordinated bedding, I made a decision that would shape the rest of my childhood. I would become perfect. Not just good enough, not just well-behaved, but flawless in every measurable way. I would give them no reason for disappointment, no cause for their particular brand of cold disapproval. I would win this silent war by surrendering completely, by erasing every part of myself that didn't meet their impossible standards. It seemed like the only logical solution to an 8-year-old mind desperate for peace. The pursuit of perfection became my full-time occupation. I developed systems and routines that would have impressed efficiency experts. Every morning, I woke up 30 minutes early to ensure my appearance met their standards, hair brushed exactly 100 times, uniform pressed to eliminate even the suggestion of wrinkles, school supplies organized in order of use. I practiced expressions in the bathroom mirror, calibrating my smile to project confidence without arrogance, enthusiasm without excess. I became a student of my parents' moods, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated which version of their daughter they required on any particular day. My grades became weapons in this domestic Cold War. Each assignment was an opportunity to prove my worth, each test a chance to demonstrate that I deserved their love. I studied with the intensity of someone preparing for life or death examinations, memorizing facts and figures that would impress teachers and parents alike. My bedroom transformed into a command center, walls covered with academic charts and achievement certificates, my desk arranged with military precision. Sleep became optional when it conflicted with the pursuit of academic excellence. The other children at school began to notice my transformation. Where once I had been friendly and spontaneous, I became calculated and reserved. Playground interactions required strategy sessions in my head, each conversation analyzed for potential risks. To my reputation, I stopped raising my hand unless I was absolutely certain of the answer, stopped participating in activities that might result in visible mistakes. My laughter became measured, my friendships conditional on whether they enhanced or threatened. My carefully constructed image at home, the war intensified even as my performance improved. Perfect grades were met with expectations of higher achievement. Flawless behavior was acknowledged with subtle suggestions for additional improvements. I learned that moving goalposts were a fundamental feature of this conflict, that victory was always just beyond reach, dangling like a carrot designed to maintain perpetual motion. My parents' approval became a drug that I needed in increasingly larger doses, yet somehow never felt fully satisfied. The physical manifestations of this stress began to show in ways that adults chose not to notice. My fingernails disappeared, entirely bitten down to painful stubs that I hid beneath long sleeves in careful positioning. My stomach developed a permanent knot that tightened whenever I heard footsteps approaching my room or keys turning in the front door lock. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by anxiety dreams where I performed on endless stages for audiences that remained perpetually unsatisfied with my efforts. My mother's garden became a metaphor for our entire family dynamic. She spent hours pruning, shaping, and controlling every plant, creating a landscape that looked magnificent from the street but felt sterile and lifeless up close. I watched her work from my bedroom window, noting how she removed anything that grew in unexpected directions, how she forced natural beauty into unnatural forms. I began to understand that I was being cultivated in much the same way, my authentic self being systematically pruned away in favor of an acceptable public display. Isolation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of this silent war. I couldn't explain to other children why I couldn't simply relax and have fun, why every activity felt like a performance evaluation. I couldn't describe the weight of constant vigilance, the exhaustion of never being able to let my guard down. My parents presented such a convincing facade of loving support that questioning their methods felt like betraying not just them, but the very concept of family itself. By the time I turned 10, I had successfully transformed myself into the daughter they wanted. My report cards were pristine, my behavior exemplary, my appearance always appropriate. Teachers praised my maturity and responsibility. Neighbors commented on how well-behaved and accomplished I was. On paper, their parenting strategy had succeeded brilliantly. What none of them realized was that in winning this war, I had lost myself so completely that I wasn't sure the original Sarah had ever really existed at all. The teenage years brought new battlefields to navigate, more sophisticated weapons to master. Adolescence, with its natural rebellion and identity formation, posed a particular threat to the delicate ecosystem we had created. My parents adapted their strategies with military precision, finding ways to maintain control while appearing to grant independence. They became experts at offering choices that weren't really choices, at providing freedom within carefully constructed boundaries. That felt more like invisible cages, high school introduced, variables that threatened our family's carefully maintained equilibrium. Suddenly, there were boys to consider, friends with different family dynamics, teachers who encouraged critical thinking that might lead to uncomfortable questions. My parents responded by intensifying their surveillance while maintaining the appearance of trust. They read my diary under the guise of cleaning my room, monitored my phone calls while pretending to give me privacy, and grilled my friends with questions disguised as friendly interest. The college application process became the ultimate test of our family's dysfunction. What should have been an exciting exploration of possibilities became a strategic campaign, designed to reflect well on my parents' child-rearing abilities. My interests were secondary to the prestige of potential universities. My passions were evaluated based on how they would look on applications rather than how they made me feel. I found myself applying to schools I had no desire to attend, pursuing activities I found meaningless, all in service of an image that had nothing to do with who I actually was or what I wanted from life. Dating presented particular challenges in our household. My parents had never explicitly forbidden relationships, but they had created an environment where bringing anyone home felt like introducing them to a performance rather than a family. The few brave boys who attempted to navigate our formal dining room conversations quickly understood that they were being evaluated not as potential partners for me, but as reflections of my parents' daughter's judgment. Most didn't return for second visits, and I couldn't blame them for fleeing what must have seemed like an elaborate audition process. My relationship with food became another casualty of the silent war. Meals at our house were theatrical productions, where every bite was monitored for appropriateness. My mother's comments about portion sizes, nutritional content, and eating habits were delivered with the subtle precision of a master manipulator. I learned to eat exactly what was expected, neither too little nor too much, to demonstrate appreciation without appearing greedy, to maintain the perfect weight that reflected well on their parenting without seeming obsessed with appearance. Emotional toll of maintaining this facade for over a decade was beginning to show in ways that concerned even my parents. My perfectionism had evolved into something darker, a compulsive need for control that extended to every aspect of my life. I organized my closet by color and season, arranged my books alphabetically, and maintained schedules that accounted for every minute of every day. Any deviation from these self-imposed routines triggered anxiety attacks that I learned to hide behind bathroom doors and fake smiles. Sleep deprivation became my constant companion as anxiety made rest impossible. I would lie awake calculating tomorrow's challenges, rehearsing conversations, and planning strategies for maintaining my perfect daughter persona. The mirror became my enemy, reflecting back a stranger who looked like me but felt hollow inside. I began to wonder if other families operated this way, if the constant vigilance and performance were normal aspects of growing up that no one talked about openly. My parents' friends often commented on how lucky they were to have such a well-behaved, accomplished daughter. These conversations happened in front of me, as if I were a trophy to be displayed rather than a person with thoughts and feelings. I learned to smile and accept compliments graciously while feeling like a fraud, knowing that the daughter they praised was as artificial as the flowers in our formal living room. The real me, whoever that might be, remained buried beneath layers of learned behavior and conditioned responses. College was supposed to be my liberation, my chance to discover who Sarah really was beneath all the conditioning and control. Instead, it became another stage where I performed the role of the perfect student, the ideal roommate, the daughter who made her parents proud even from a distance. I had become so skilled at being what others expected that I no longer knew how to access my authentic desires, my genuine preferences, my real personality. Freedom felt more terrifying than the familiar constraints of home because it required making choices based on what I wanted rather than what was expected. My roommate, Jennifer, came from what she called a messy family. Her parents divorced. When she was 12, her siblings fought constantly, and holiday gatherings resembled chaotic festivals rather than carefully orchestrated productions. At first, I felt superior to her apparent lack of discipline and structure. Gradually, however, I began to envy something I couldn't quite name: an authenticity, a comfort with imperfection, an ability to express genuine emotions without calculating their impact on others. She cried when she was sad, laughed when things were funny, and got angry when she felt wronged. These seemed like revolutionary concepts to someone who had spent years moderating every emotional response. The academic pressure at university was intense, but it was pressure I understood and could navigate. What challenged me more were the social situations that required spontaneity and genuine connection. Parties were minefields of unpredictable interactions where my carefully rehearsed responses often seemed inappropriate or forced. I found myself studying other students the way I had once studied my parents, trying to decode the rules of authentic social interaction that seemed to come naturally to everyone else. My major in psychology was initially chosen because it sounded impressive and practical, the kind of choice my parents would approve of. Unexpectedly, the coursework began to illuminate patterns in my own life that I had never questioned. Learning about family systems, attachment styles, and psychological development gave me vocabulary for experiences I had never been able to articulate. For the first time, I began to suspect that my childhood might not have been as perfect as everyone believed, that the war I had fought might not have been necessary or healthy. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. If my family dynamic was dysfunctional, then everything I had built my identity around was false. The perfect daughter persona that had consumed my life was not just unnecessary, but potentially harmful to my development. I began to see my parents' behavior not as loving guidance, but as emotional manipulation designed to serve their needs, rather than mine. The anger that followed this realization was overwhelming and unfamiliar, an emotion I had never allowed myself to feel fully. Phone calls home became increasingly difficult as I struggled to maintain the facade while internally questioning everything about our relationship. My parents sensed the change and responded with increased attempts at control disguised as concern. They questioned my friends, my grades, my life choices with the subtle intensity I remembered from childhood. The difference now was that I could recognize the manipulation even if I wasn't yet strong enough to resist it completely. Spring break of my sophomore year marked a turning point in our family's Cold War. I had been invited to spend the week with Jennifer's family in California, an opportunity that represented everything my upbringing had taught me to avoid: unpredictability, informality, genuine emotional expression. My parents' reaction to this plan revealed the extent of their need for control. What began as subtle discouragement escalated to guilt trips, emotional manipulation, and finally direct orders disguised as strong suggestions. For the first time in my life, I said no and meant it. The trip to California was like visiting another planet. Jennifer's family fought openly, laughed loudly, and expressed affection without conditions or calculations. Meals were chaotic affairs, where people interrupted each other, reached across the table, and talked about real problems without pretending everything was perfect. I watched in amazement as Jennifer argued with her mother about politics, then hugged her minutes later without any residual tension. These people seemed to love each other not despite their flaws, but including them. Returning home after that, Week felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit. The formal dining room, the perfect flower arrangements, the careful conversations, everything that had once seemed normal now felt suffocating and artificial. I began to see our house not as a sanctuary, but as a museum where real life was not permitted to intrude on the carefully maintained display. The summer between sophomore and junior year became a season of quiet rebellion and growing self-awareness. I took a job at a local bookstore against my parents' wishes, choosing work that interested me over internships that would look impressive. On my resume, the bookstore was owned by an elderly woman named Mrs. Chun, who had emigrated from Taiwan with nothing but determination and hope. Her approach to employment was revolutionary to someone raised on performance metrics and constant evaluation. She cared more about whether I enjoyed the work than whether I excelled at every task. Working alongside people from different backgrounds exposed me to perspectives that challenged everything I had been taught about success and happiness. My coworker Marcus was pursuing a degree in art therapy, a field my parents would have dismissed as impractical and financially irresponsible. Yet he radiated a contentment and sense of purpose that I envied desperately. He talked about his work with passion, about helping children express trauma through creativity, about finding meaning in service rather than achievement. These conversations planted seeds of possibility that I hadn't known existed. The bookstore became my laboratory for experimenting with authenticity. Away from my parents' watchful eyes, I began to express opinions I had never shared, to laugh at things I genuinely found funny rather than things I thought I should find amusing. I discovered that I had preferences about music, books, and ideas that had nothing to do with what was expected or appropriate. These small acts of self-expression felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Like learning to walk after years of being carried dog, my relationship with food began to heal in this environment, where no one monitored my choices or commented on my eating. Habits. Mrs. Chun kept a small kitchen in the back of the store where employees could prepare simple meals, and I found myself actually enjoying the process of cooking for the first time in years. Without the weight of judgment and expectation, eating became about nourishment rather than performance, about satisfaction rather than control. The books surrounding me daily offered windows into lives and experiences far removed from my own carefully controlled existence. I devoured memoirs of people who had overcome difficult childhoods, psychology texts that explained family dynamics, novels that portrayed complex, flawed characters who were lovable despite their imperfections. Literature became my therapy before I was brave enough to seek actual counseling, offering validation for feelings I had never been permitted to acknowledge. My parents' reaction to my summer job revealed the depth of their investment in controlling my narrative. They couldn't understand why I would choose retail work over prestigious internships, why I would associate with people they considered beneath our family status. Their disapproval was palpable during the few dinners I still attended at home, delivered through significant glances and loaded questions about my future plans. The war was escalating as I began to resist their version of my story. The most significant change that summer was internal. I began to feel angry. And for the first time in my life, I didn't immediately try to suppress that emotion. The anger was complicated and multi-layered, directed at my parents for their manipulation, at myself for my compliance, at a society that had praised my dysfunction as achievement. I felt robbed of a childhood, cheated of the opportunity to discover who I might have been without constant surveillance and correction. This anger was uncomfortable, but ultimately necessary for my development. My friendship with Jennifer deepened as I began to share pieces of my real story rather than the sanitized version I had always presented. Her reactions helped me understand how abnormal my upbringing had been. She was shocked by stories I considered normal, outraged by behaviors I had accepted as loving guidance. Her perspective became a mirror that reflected back the truth I had been avoiding. My childhood had been a form of emotional abuse disguised as exceptional parenting. As the summer ended and I prepared to return to school, I made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life. I would seek counseling through the university's mental health services. The perfect daughter would never admit to needing psychological help, would never acknowledge that her family might be dysfunctional. But the real Sarah, the one who was slowly emerging from years of repression, knew that professional help was essential for her survival and growth. The war was far from over, but for the first time, I was fighting back with weapons of my own. Truth, authenticity, and a growing understanding of what healthy relationships actually looked like. The battle lines were being redrawn, and I was no longer willing to surrender without a fight. Dr. Patricia Williams was nothing like what I had expected from a therapist. Instead of the stern, analytical figure I had imagined, she was warm and approachable, with laugh lines around her eyes and an office that felt more like a comfortable living room than a clinical space. Our first session was awkward as I struggled to articulate problems that I had spent years convincing myself didn't exist. How do you explain that your perfect childhood was actually a nightmare when you have no obvious scars to show for it? The process of unpacking 2 decades of conditioning was slow and painful. Dr. Williams introduced me to concepts that reframed my entire understanding of family relationships, emotional manipulation, conditional love, psychological control, perfectionism as a trauma response. Each session peeled back another layer of the narrative I had constructed about my life, revealing truths that were both liberating and devastating. I began to understand that my parents' behavior wasn't loving guidance, but a sophisticated form of psychological abuse designed to maintain their image and control. My academic performance began to suffer as I devoted energy to healing rather than achieving. For the first time in my life, I received grades that weren't perfect, and the world didn't end. This revelation was both terrifying and empowering. I had spent so many years believing that my worth was directly tied to my achievements that experiencing failure without catastrophic consequences felt revolutionary. I was learning to separate my value as a person from my performance as a student. The holidays that year became a test of my newfound awareness and growing boundaries. Returning home for Thanksgiving, I saw our family dynamics with fresh eyes, recognizing patterns of manipulation and control that had previously seemed normal. The formal dinner conversation, the subtle criticisms disguised as concern, the way my parents presented our family to extended relatives as a picture of success and harmony. Everything felt like performance art designed to maintain an illusion. Rather than celebrate genuine connection, I attempted to have an honest conversation with my mother about my therapy and my growing understanding of our family dynamics. Her reaction was swift and devastating. Denial, followed by hurt feelings, then accusations that I was being ungrateful and influenced by outsiders who didn't understand our special bond. She turned my attempt at honesty into evidence of my disloyalty, my therapy into a betrayal of our family values. The conversation ended with her tears and my retreat to familiar patterns of apologizing and reassuring. My father's response was more subtle but equally controlling. He expressed concern about the cost of therapy, questioned the credentials of my counselor, and suggested that dwelling on the past was unhealthy and self-indulgent. His approach was to intellectualize and minimize my experience, to present logical arguments for why their parenting had been appropriate and successful. He pointed to my academic achievements, my good behavior, my lack of involvement with drugs or crime as evidence that their methods had been effective. The winter break stretched endlessly as I navigated this new awareness while maintaining enough of the old facade to survive family gatherings. I felt like a spy in my own home, observing and analyzing interactions that I had previously participated in unconsciously. The emotional labor of maintaining these dual perspectives was exhausting, but it was necessary for my continued growth and eventual independence. Returning to school after the holidays felt like emerging from underwater. The relief of being away from the constant performance pressure was enormous, but it was accompanied by guilt and confusion about my family relationships. Dr. Williams helped me understand that feeling guilty about setting boundaries with abusive behavior was normal and expected. The guilt was actually evidence that I was breaking free from their conditioning, that I was beginning to prioritize my own well-being over their comfort. My relationships with friends began to deepen as I learned to be more authentic and vulnerable. I shared pieces of my real story with carefully chosen people, testing the waters of genuine connection. Their responses ranged from shock to recognition to protective anger on my behalf. Some friends shared their own stories of difficult family dynamics, and I realized that many people carried hidden wounds from childhoods that looked perfect from the outside but were painful to live inside. The spring semester brought new challenges. As I began to make decisions based on my own interests rather than my parents' expectations, I changed my major from pre-law to social work, a choice that represented everything they had taught me to avoid: modest financial prospects, emotional demands, work with populations they considered beneath our family status. Their reaction was swift and predictable, but for the first time, I held firm in my decision despite their disapproval. The decision to change majors triggered what I now recognize as the most intense phase of our family's silent war. My parents deployed every weapon in their considerable arsenal: emotional manipulation, financial threats, appeals to family loyalty, and predictions of future regret. They painted my choice as a temporary rebellion that would pass once I came to my senses, refusing to acknowledge that it might represent genuine growth and self-discovery rather than youthful foolishness. My mother's response was particularly sophisticated in its cruelty. She began sharing stories about my childhood with relatives and family friends, emphasizing how proud she had always been of my academic achievements and my plans for a prestigious career. These conversations happened in my presence, designed to remind me of the expectations I was disappointing and the image I was destroying. She spoke about my therapy as if it were a phase, like adolescent acne or a rebellious haircut that would eventually resolve itself. Financial pressure became their primary weapon as they threatened to withdraw support from my education if I didn't return to a more practical major. This threat was particularly effective because I had never learned to be financially independent, had never been encouraged to work or save money during high school. Their control had extended to every aspect of my life, including my economic security, making rebellion financially dangerous as well as emotionally difficult. Dr. Williams helped me develop strategies for managing these escalating conflicts while maintaining my commitment to authentic living. We worked on recognizing manipulation tactics, setting boundaries despite guilt and pressure, and building financial independence gradually. She introduced me to concepts from family therapy that helped me understand why my parents were so threatened by my growth. My authenticity challenged the narrative they had constructed about themselves as successful parents. I took on additional work-study hours and applied for scholarships to reduce my dependence on my parents' financial support. This process was humbling and scary, requiring me to advocate for myself in ways I had never learned to do. But each small step toward independence felt like reclaiming a piece of my life that had been held hostage by their expectations and control. The work was difficult but deeply satisfying in a way that academic achievement had never been. My relationship with Jennifer continued to be a source of support and perspective during this tumultuous period. She offered practical advice about financial aid, emotional support during difficult phone calls with my parents, and most importantly, a model of what healthy family relationships could look like. Her family's acceptance of my changed major stood in stark contrast to my parents' reaction, showing me that love didn't have to be conditional on meeting specific expectations. The summer before my senior year, I made the decision to stay at school rather than return home. I found a small apartment near campus and increased my work hours to cover living expenses. My parents' reaction to this choice was swift and severe. They cut off all financial support and told extended family that I had chosen to estrange myself from the family. This narrative reversal was typical of their approach, presenting themselves as victims of my unreasonable behavior rather than acknowledging their role in driving me away. Living independently for the first time was both exhilarating and terrifying. Simple decisions like what to eat for breakfast or how to spend Sunday afternoon required me to access preferences I had never been encouraged to develop. I had to learn basic life skills that many of my peers had acquired naturally: budgeting, cooking, maintaining friendships without parental supervision. Everything felt new and overwhelming, but also authentic in a way my life had never been before. My academic performance in social work courses was different from my previous achievement-focused approach to education. Instead of memorizing information to regurgitate on tests, I was learning concepts that helped me understand human behavior and social systems. The material felt relevant to my life experience in ways that pre-law courses never had. I was particularly drawn to classes about family therapy and trauma recovery, finding in them both professional knowledge and personal healing. The loneliness was the most difficult aspect of this. New independence. I had never learned to be alone with my thoughts and feelings without immediately seeking approval or validation from others. Silence felt dangerous after years of using constant activity and achievement to avoid confronting uncomfortable emotions. But gradually, I began to enjoy my own company, to find peace and solitude that didn't require performance or vigilance. My relationship with my parents settled into a pattern of minimal contact characterized by surface politeness and underlying tension. Phone calls were brief and focused on neutral topics. Holiday plans became complicated negotiations rather than assumed family obligations. They continued to express hope that I would come to my senses and return to the path they had planned. For me, while I worked to maintain boundaries that protected my hard-won authenticity, senior year brought the challenge of planning a future that belonged entirely to me for the first time in my life. Graduate school applications and social work required essays about personal motivation and career goals that forced me to articulate who I was becoming rather than who I had been programmed to be. Writing these essays was both therapeutic and terrifying, requiring me to claim ownership of my story and my choices in ways that felt revolutionary after years of living someone else's vision of my life. My field placement was at a domestic violence shelter where I worked with women and children escaping abusive relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was helping others recognize and leave toxic family dynamics while still struggling to fully understand and heal from my own. The women I worked with often described the subtle forms of control and manipulation that had characterized their relationships, and I found myself nodding in recognition at tactics I knew intimately from my childhood. One client in particular, Maria, became a mirror that reflected my own experience back to me. She had left a marriage where her husband never hit her, but controlled every aspect of her life through criticism, financial manipulation, and isolation from support systems. Her description of walking on eggshells, constantly adjusting her behavior to avoid conflict, and losing herself in the process of trying to be the perfect wife could have been written about my childhood. Our conversations helped me understand that abuse doesn't always leave visible marks. The work at the shelter was emotionally demanding, but deeply fulfilling in ways that academic achievement had never been. I was using my painful experiences to help others, transforming my trauma into a tool for healing and empowerment. The women and children I worked with taught me about resilience, courage, and the possibility of rebuilding identity after years of psychological control. Their recovery journeys gave me hope for my own continued growth and healing. My relationship with Dr. Williams evolved as I prepared to graduate and transition to independent adulthood. We worked on strategies for maintaining healthy boundaries with my family while remaining open to the possibility of improved relationships in the future. She helped me understand that healing is not a linear process, that setbacks and moments of doubt are normal parts of recovery from childhood trauma. Most importantly, she taught me to trust my own perceptions and feelings after years of being told they were wrong or unreasonable. The question of graduation, attendance became a focal point for family conflict. My parents wanted to attend the ceremony to present themselves as proud, supportive parents celebrating their daughter's achievement. I struggled with allowing them to claim credit for my success when they had actively opposed the path that led to this moment. The ceremony represented my liberation from their expectations, but their presence would transform it back into a performance for their benefit rather than a celebration of my authentic choices. After much deliberation and consultation with Dr. Williams, I decided to invite them to graduation with clear boundaries about their behavior and our interactions. I wrote a letter explaining that while they were welcome to attend, I wouldn't tolerate criticism of my choices or attempts to undermine my decisions about my future. The letter represented a new phase in our relationship, where I was no longer willing to sacrifice my well-being for their comfort or approval. Their response to my letter was predictably complex, hurt feelings mixed with grudging respect, disappointment, tempered by reluctant pride. They agreed to attend under my conditions, though I could sense their struggle with the power dynamic shift that my boundaries represented. For the first time in our relationship, I was setting the terms rather than adapting to theirs, and this reversal was uncomfortable for all of us. Graduate school acceptance letters began arriving in early spring, and I was accepted to several programs with funding packages that would allow me to continue my education without their financial support. The relief of knowing I could pursue my goals independently was enormous, but it was accompanied by sadness about the relationship with my parents that might have been possible under different circumstances. I grieved the fantasy of unconditional parental love while celebrating my growing capacity for self-support and self-determination that my friendship network had expanded to include other students in my program who shared my commitment to social justice and helping others. These relationships were built on shared values and genuine connection rather than proximity or convenience. I was learning to choose friends who supported my authentic self rather than my performed persona, and the difference in relationship quality was remarkable. These friendships nourished me in ways I had never experienced before. Graduation day arrived with a mixture of celebration and complexity that seemed to characterize all major milestones in my relationship with my parents. They attended the ceremony dressed impeccably, presenting the image of proud, supportive parents to anyone who might observe our family dynamics. But beneath the surface performance, I could feel the tension of unresolved conflicts and competing narratives about what this achievement represented and who deserved credit for it. The ceremony itself was deeply meaningful to me in ways that had nothing to do with external validation or approval. Walking across that stage represented not just academic completion, but personal liberation from years of living according to someone else's expectations. I was receiving a degree in a field I had chosen based on my own values and interests, funded through my own work and determination. This was the first major accomplishment in my life that belonged entirely to me. My parents' behavior during the graduation weekend revealed how much our relationship had changed and how much work still needed to be done. They struggled to navigate social situations without being able to control the narrative about our family. When other parents asked about my plans for graduate school, they couldn't help but express subtle reservations about my choices while attempting to appear supportive. Their discomfort was palpable and somewhat satisfying after years of feeling uncomfortable in my own skin. The dinner after graduation was a carefully choreographed affair where we all played roles designed to maintain family harmony while avoiding the deeper issues that divided us. They praised my academic success while avoiding any mention of my major or career plans. I accepted their congratulations while maintaining the boundaries I had established about my future decisions. We were like actors in a play where everyone knew their lines, but no one believed in the script. Moving to a new city for graduate school felt like the final step in my journey toward independence and authenticity. I was leaving behind not just my undergraduate life, but also the geographic proximity to my parents that had made their influence feel so immediate and overwhelming. The physical distance would create space for emotional distance, allowing me to continue developing my identity without constant pressure to revert to familiar patterns. My graduate program in social work was intellectually challenging and emotionally demanding in ways that felt purposeful and meaningful. Unlike my undergraduate experience, where academic success had been primarily about external validation, this education was clearly connected to my personal mission of helping others heal from trauma and build authentic lives. The coursework built on my own healing journey while preparing me to guide others through similar processes. The other students in my program came from diverse backgrounds and life experiences, many carrying their own stories of overcoming adversity and choosing careers in service to others. This community understood the connection between personal healing and professional effectiveness in ways that my previous academic environments had not. I found myself in conversations about trauma, resilience, and social justice that fed my soul while challenging my intellect. My field placement was at a community mental health center, serving low-income families dealing with various forms of trauma and stress. The work was difficult but deeply rewarding, requiring me to use all the skills I had developed in understanding family dynamics, setting boundaries, and maintaining authentic relationships while providing professional support. I was particularly effective with clients who had experienced childhood emotional abuse, drawing on my own experience while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. Contact with my parents became increasingly sporadic as I established my new life and routine. Our phone calls were brief and surface level, focusing on neutral topics like weather and general health, rather than anything meaningful about my experiences or feelings. They seemed to be waiting for me to outgrow this phase of independence and return to their version of our relationship, while I was building a life that had no room for their particular brand of conditional love and control. The holidays that first year of graduate school marked a turning point in my relationship with my family of origin.